Come on, not today!
She was cast into the river, but he rode through the storm to find her the river. The rain had been falling since dawn. It came in long silver cords, cutting the red dust into clay and turning the air into breathless mist. Salt River ran swollen and furious through the canyon, its color the brown of coffee and blood. Elias Kane rode along the ridge, soaked through hat brim, dripping steady lines onto the neck of his horse. The gelding's hooves sloshed through the flooded trail, each step sinking, pulling free with a wet gasp. He had lost one mare at dawn, a young bay that had bolted at the first crack of thunder. He should have let her go, but a man who lived by horses learned not to give them up easy. Lightning flashed. For one slow second, the whole valley turned white. Then came the thunder, close enough to shake his ribs. He muttered under his breath, half to the sky, half to the ghosts that seemed to live in weather like this. Hell of a day to be alive. Down below the river, tore through willows and cottonwoods thick with debris. He pulled the reins, trying to see through the sheet of rain. Something pale caught his eye, a tangle of fabric, or maybe an animal caught on the roots of a fallen tree. It moved. Elias stared, heart stumbling once in his chest. It wasn't fabric. It was a body. He kicked his horse forward, sliding down the muddy bank. The gelding balked at the water's edge, nostrils flaring. Elias swung off, boots sinking to the ankle. "Stay," he said softly, though the horse couldn't hear over the storm. The current tugged at him the moment he stepped in. Cold bit his legs. The river climbed his waist, his chest, the roar filling his ears. The figure was 30 feet out, trapped against a branch that bent and strained with the weight. He dove. The water slammed him sideways. For a heartbeat, there was no up or down, only silt and noise and the memory of gunfire. He kicked hard, broke the surface, gasping. There, an arm, dark hair plastered against a face too still. He reached her, grabbed the branch, then her wrist. The skin was cold as stone. "Come on," he said, voice swallowed by the rain. "Not today." It took every ounce of strength to drag her free. When they reached the shallows, his knees hit gravel, lungs burning. He pulled her up onto the mud, rolled her onto her back. Her face was young, her clothes torn. Her skin carried the hue of sun and smoke, and he saw the faint lines of Apache beadwork along her belt. A woman. He pressed his ear to her chest. Nothing. Then he set his hands, began to press steady, hard. "Breathe," he whispered. "Come on, girl. Breathe." The rain beat down unrelenting. Once, twice again, until a weak cough tore the silence. Water spilled from her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused. Elias leaned back, shaking, mud streaking his arms. Relief hit him like another wave. "You're all right," he said. "You're all right." She didn't understand. Her lips moved, something between a prayer and a warning. Then she went still again, breathing, shallow eyes half closed. He looked toward the hills. His cabin was half a mile upriver. The horse stood waiting, head low against the rain. Elias wiped his face, stood, and lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than she looked. The storm had no mercy, but neither did he. He carried her through it, step by step, back toward the line of cottonwoods where smoke would soon rise from his chimney. The cabin. By the time Elias reached the cabin, his arms burned from the weight. The rain had softened to a thick drizzle, the kind that felt more like touch than weather. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepped inside, and laid her down on the narrow bed beside the wall. The room smelled of pine and smoke. A kettle sat cold on the stove, forgotten since morning. He knelt, struck a match, and the flame flared small, defiant against the gray light. Her lips were bluish. He stripped off the wet blanket wrapped around her shoulders and replaced it with one of his own rough wool that had known too many winters. He hesitated before touching her again, then pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Still breathing. Shallow, but there. He poured water into a tin cup, held it near her mouth. A few drops slid between her lips. She swallowed weakly. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He set the cup down, peeled off his soaked coat, and tossed it over the chair. The sound of rain against the roof filled the silence. It was steady now, almost gentle. When she stirred, it was small, an eyelid flutter, a twitch of the hand. He moved closer. Her eyes opened dark and wide. For a second they met his. Confusion, then fear. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're safe here." The words meant nothing to her. He could see that. But his tone made her still. She tried to sit up. Her legs wouldn't move. Pain crossed her face, sharp and sudden. She reached down, pressed her palms to her thighs, as if willing them to obey. Nothing. He saw the realization fall over her the way people look when they understand something they can't fix. Elias crouched beside her. "Don't," he said softly. "You'll hurt yourself." She looked at him, then really looked, mud drying on his jaw. The scar along his cheekbone, the lines carved by sun and silence. She said something in Apache, short, guttural, impossible for him to catch. He shook his head. "I don't understand." The rain thickened again. He turned to the stove, ladled what was left of yesterday's stew into a pot, set it over the flame. The scent of onions and venison crept through the room, slow and human. Behind him she whispered another word. It sounded like Tani. He looked over his shoulder. "What's that mean?" She touched her chest, then made a slow motion, downward, palm open. "River." Elias nodded. "Yeah," he murmured, "the river." He didn't know what else to say. When the stew was ready, he filled a bowl and held it out to her. She hesitated, then took it, hands trembling from exhaustion. Steam rose between them, curling like breath. He sat on the floor near the fire, boots off, socks steaming. Outside, thunder rolled far away, just a reminder now, not a threat. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel empty. He didn't know her name, or if she'd lived through the night, but she was here. And somehow that changed the sound of the rain. The hours bled together after that. The light turned from gray to black and back again without asking his permission. She slept most of the time, drifting between fever and silence. Once, in the dim light before dawn, she began to mutter in her tongue, low, rhythmic, like a prayer trying to find its way home. Elias sat by the fire and listened, not for meaning but for proof that she was still among the living. He had seen death often enough to know its quiet too well. This wasn't it. This was life clinging by its fingernails. He warmed a cloth, wrung it out, and wiped the mud from her arms and face. Beneath the dirt, her skin was a lattice of scars, some fresh, others pale with time. He didn't let himself wonder what kind of hands had left them. When he reached her right leg, he stopped. The bone had set wrong after the fall. He could see the swelling, the wrong angle of it. He whispered a curse under his breath. Setting it would mean pain. Not setting it meant she'd never walk right again. He found whiskey in the cabinet, a bottle so old the cork had dried. He took a swallow, then another, before pouring some into a cup and setting it beside her. "This'll help," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand. She blinked up at him, half aware. He motioned to the cup. She sipped once, coughed, eyes watering. He took a strip of cloth, folded it, and handed it to her. "Bite." She obeyed, maybe out of exhaustion more than trust. He set his jaw, gripped her leg above the break, and pulled. The crack came soft but deep, like a tree splitting in winter. She screamed into the cloth. The sound cut through him like glass. He kept steady until the bone slid back into place. When it was done, he tied the splint with linen and leather, his hands shaking harder than hers. When she finally went limp, he sat back on the floor, chest heaving. The storm outside had thinned to mist. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called long and lonely. He stared at her sleeping face, the fine line of her nose, the smudge of ash on her cheek, the stubborn pulse still working in her throat. She looked impossibly young and impossibly old, at the same time, like someone who'd seen too much too soon. Morning came cold. The kind of cold that makes a man question if the sun's still doing its job. Elias stepped outside to fetch more wood. The hills were wet and shining, steam rising from every rock. The world smelled washed, as if all its sins had been scrubbed overnight. He filled the bucket from the cistern and stood there a moment listening. The river below murmured, full and restless. When he came back in, the cabin felt different, warmer, lived in. She was awake, watching him. Her eyes followed every move, cautious, assessing. She looked like she was trying to memorize the shape of his kindness, unsure if it would last. He nodded once toward the stove. Hungry, he held up the bowl, mind-eating. After a pause, she nodded faintly. He smiled without meaning to. He poured out the last of the stew, added water, stirred. The spoon scraped the bottom of the pot with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. As she ate, he spoke half to her, half to himself. Found you near the ridge. Thought you were gone when I pulled you out. Guess you're tougher than the rest of us. She listened, not understanding, but her eyes softened, as if tone alone could translate. He pointed to himself. Elias. Then to her. You. She hesitated, then touched her chest. Nasha. Her voice was hoarse, but the word came clear. He repeated it softly, careful not to break it. Nasha. She nodded once. For the first time, the air between them felt like it had a name. By noon, the sky had cleared to a pale, bruised blue. The cabin steamed from drying clothes and damp wood. Nasha slept again, her hand resting over the blanket's edge. Elias sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle out of habit. He wasn't thinking about danger, not yet. He was thinking about how the smallest sounds, the drip from the roof, the soft exhale of a sleeping stranger, could make a place feel like a home again. He didn't know what waited beyond the ridge, or who might come looking for her. But for now, the rain had stopped. The fire was steady, and for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The world outside would come calling soon enough. But inside the cabin, mercy had already begun to take shape, quiet, human, and utterly uninvited. The silence between them. 3 days passed. The rain did not stop, only changed its voice. At night it whispered against the roof like distant talk. By day it came in bursts, heavy, then still heavy again. The world shrank to the size of the cabin, to the hiss of the fire, and the slow measured sound of breathing. Elias fixed a splint for her back using 2 planed boards and strips of torn saddle leather. He'd done the same once for a horse with a broken leg, though this time his hands worked slower, gentler. The woman watched him, eyes following every motion. When the pain came, she didn't flinch or cry out, just clenched her jaw and stared past his shoulder at the rain. He could see her willpower, thin as paper but steady as grain under pressure. She still said little. Sometimes a sound escaped her, a sigh, a half-formed word, but mostly she existed in quiet like a bird, afraid to startle itself. Her body was bruised but healing, her legs still motionless. Each morning he chopped wood. Each afternoon he brought water from the barrel outside. She watched from the bed, wrapped in his blanket, hair drying into black ropes that clung to her cheeks. Once she reached for the bowl, he sat down and managed to feed herself, hand trembling but proud. He pretended not to notice. That night, lightning flashed far off. The air smelled of juniper and wet dust. Elias sat sharpening his knife near the stove, letting the rhythm fill the silence. The scrape of metal on stone felt almost like breathing, the only language they both understood. She gestured toward the window, spoke a word he couldn't place. What he asked, setting down the blade. She pointed again. He looked and saw what she meant. A small bird soaked through, lying beneath the sill. Its wings quivered once, then stilled. Before he could move, she was already trying to reach it, dragging herself with her arms face tight with effort. Elias caught her halfway. "Wait," he said, voice low but firm. But she shook her head, breath ragged, and kept going until her hand brushed the bird's feathers. She lifted it, carefully cupped between both palms. The rain dripped from her hair, darkening the blanket she'd pulled around her shoulders. Back by the fire, she placed it on a flat piece of wood, folded the wings over its body, and whispered something soft. Her voice was rough, but the tone held weight, neither prayer nor farewell, something older. Elias didn't ask what it meant. He only watched as she set the little form beside the flame. When she looked up, he met her eyes. For a long time, neither of them moved. Finally, she spoke a word. "Spirit." He nodded, the word foreign in his mouth. "Spirit." She gave a small, almost invisible smile. Outside, the rain eased into mist. By the 4th day, the rhythm of the cabin had changed. It was no longer a man's house. It had become a place where silence lived comfortably between 2 heartbeats. Elias rose early as always. He shaved wood curls for kindling, boiled water, mended what needed mending. She watched him sometimes, though not with fear anymore. Curiosity had taken its place, quiet but present. When he caught her looking, she didn't turn away as before. He began leaving small things where she could reach them: a cup, a folded cloth, the knife he used to peel potatoes. Not out of trust yet, but out of something close. In the evenings, when the sky bruised and thunder rolled like faraway wagons, they would share the same silence by the fire. The only sound between them was the soft pop of sap in the wood and the steady rain against the roof. Once, while stirring the stew, Elias asked her name again. She hesitated. "Nasha," she said finally, each syllable careful, as if stepping across a broken bridge. He repeated it slower. "Nascha." Her eyes flickered in approval, or maybe amusement. "Elias," he said, tapping his chest. She nodded once. Elias. The way she said it made the name sound new, carved smooth, with edges rounded by another language. That night she dreamed. He could tell by the way her hands moved under the blanket, fingers curling as if clutching something unseen. She woke, gasping sweat along her temples, eyes wide but unfocused. Elias was already beside her with a cup of water. She pushed it away at first, shaking her head, muttering a word he didn't know. Her breathing came fast and shallow. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe. Nobody here but me." She stared at him, the word safe meaning nothing, but the tone meaning everything. After a long moment she took the cup. Her hand brushed his. The touch was cold but alive. Later, when she lay back down, she whispered something to the dark. He didn't understand, but he caught the sound of one name repeated like a wound reopened. He sat by the fire until dawn, without sleeping, listening to the rain and the small sounds she made as dreams came and went. The fifth morning broke with light that felt like glass, thin, gray, fragile. He opened the shutters. Outside, the world was washed clean. The ground shimmered where puddles had gathered in the ruts of old wagon tracks. The river below the ridge ran fat and brown with floodwater. Nasha turned her head toward the light, eyes narrowing. He saw her nostrils flare, the first deep breath she'd taken in days. He watched her face as she looked out, the faint color returning to her cheeks, the shadow of a woman who had once lived under open sky. There was a longing there he didn't intrude upon. He poured coffee for himself, hot and bitter. The smell filled the cabin. She gestured toward the pot. "You want some?" She nodded. He poured a little into a cup, blew on it, then offered it to her. She sipped, coughed once, then laughed, a breath of sound that was almost joy. He smiled. Too strong. She pointed at him, eyes teasing. "Strong." He laughed quietly. "Maybe." For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt shared. That afternoon he went outside to check the traps along the ridge. The sky was still low and bruised, but the rain had stopped. He found 2 rabbits caught in the wire-clean kills. He thanked whatever mercy ruled the wild and slung them over his shoulder. When he came back, smoke curled from the chimney. For a second he froze. He hadn't lit the fire before leaving, but as he stepped inside, the sight made him pause. Nasha sat near the hearth blanket around her shoulders, using a stick to push a log deeper into the coals. She dragged herself across the floor to tend it. The effort must have hurt like hell, but her expression was calm, almost proud. She looked up at him, and for the first time, didn't seem like someone trapped in a stranger's home. "You shouldn't be up," he said. She tilted her head, not understanding all of it, but catching the shape of his disapproval. "Fire," she said, touching her chest. "Live." He couldn't argue with that. "Yeah," he murmured. "Fire lives." He cleaned the rabbits outside, brought the meat in, cooked them with beans and salt. When he handed her a bowl, she accepted it without hesitation. She even muttered a word, something soft and short, before eating. He asked, "What's that mean?" She tapped her lips. "Thanks." He nodded. "Thanks." When she repeated it in English, the sound came strange but beautiful. Later, as night fell, they shared the small table. Rain returned and a thin silver curtain tapping the roof like fingertips. The firelight painted their faces gold and red. Elias found himself telling her things. He hadn't spoken aloud in years, how he'd come west after the war, how silence had been his only company since. She didn't understand most of the words, but she listened, eyes steady. When he paused, she said softly, "Soldier." He nodded. "Yes." Her gaze drifted toward the scars on his hands, the old burn across his wrist. She traced the air above them, not touching, only marking their shape. Then she said, "Hurt stays." He met her eyes. Yeah, it does. She pointed to her own chest. Here too. The rain outside quickened a percussion of unspoken things. He looked away first, poking the fire with the iron rod. When he turned back, she was smiling faintly. Not pity, not sorrow, just acknowledgement. Two people haunted by different ghosts, who had somehow found the same quiet ground. On the sixth night, thunder rolled again, closer this time. Wind pressed against the shutters. The cabin creaked. Elias checked the latch, then the rifle leaning by the door. Habit. Nasha watched him from the bed, face unreadable. He caught her gaze. "You've seen storms like this," she considered, then lifted her hand, drawing a spiral in the air. "Sky angry," she said, half grinning. "Yeah," he said, "sky's got a temper." The wind howled, and the walls shuddered. He added another log to the fire. The warmth spread through the small room, the color of molten amber. She watched the flame for a long time. Fire. "Talk," she said slowly. He frowned. "Talk," she nodded. "Spirits, listen. Come when fire burns." He didn't laugh. Something in her tone told him it wasn't superstition. It was remembrance. He stared into the flame too, wondering if the dead he'd left behind were somewhere in there, sitting quiet between the sparks. After a while, she said, "Your heart heavy." He looked up, startled. "You don't even know me." But she just pointed at his chest again. "I know." He didn't argue. By morning, the storm had moved east. The air smelled sharp and new. Elias opened the door and stepped out into a world of puddles and birdsong. The first real sun in a week poured gold over the ridge. When he came back, she was awake, hair loose over her shoulders, light catching the strands. He stopped in the doorway, caught by how alive she looked in the daylight. She noticed him watching and said something in Apache too fast for him to catch. Then, shyly, she repeated in halting English, "You look ghost." He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Probably." She pointed to his chest again. "No ghost here." That stopped him. He didn't know whether she meant his heart, or herself, or something between them. He poured water into a bowl, set it beside her, and sat across the room. For a long while neither spoke. The only sound was the steady drip from the eaves and the quiet crackle of coals. The silence between them no longer carried distance, it carried breath. That evening she asked for the window to be opened. He hesitated. The air still carried chill, but her eyes pleaded. He unlatched it. The wind came in soft, carrying the smell of earth and sage. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. He watched her hand twitch, fingers curling slightly, as if remembering the feel of soil. "Home?" he asked. She opened her eyes and nodded slowly. Not same, but near. He understood that. Home wasn't a place you returned to. It was the one you made again out of ruin. The firelight flickered across the room, gold fading to blue. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted beyond the ridge. Elias sat back, letting the sound of her breathing blend with the night. Somewhere between the whisper of wind and the steady rhythm of rain on the roof, two strangers had stopped being strangers. And in that silence, the deep living silence of two people who no longer needed words, the world began again. The storm returns. The rain stopped on the fifth morning. What was left behind was silence, thick and bright, filled with the hum of wet ground and the far cry of hawks. Elias stepped outside for the first time in days. The world smelled of pine and mud. The river had fallen back within its banks, but the land still gleamed like new skin, as if the earth itself had shed something old. He walked down to check the horse. The animal snorted softly when he approached, restless but unharmed. Then Elias noticed them hoofprints in the soft earth beside the corral, not his own. He crouched, tracing the indentations with a calloused hand. 3, maybe 4 riders. Fresh tracks. They'd come close enough to see smoke from his chimney, and turned back toward the ridge. He felt it then, the prickle at the base of the neck, that every man who's lived through battle comes to know. The sense of being watched. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Not even the jays called. He looked toward the tree line where mist drifted like smoke, and knew what it meant. Trouble didn't always announce itself. It lingered, patient as hunger. When he went inside, she was sitting up against the wall, her eyes already fixed on the door. She could read the look on his face before he spoke. "Men," he said. He mimed the shape of a hat, then the curve of a rifle. She nodded, once lips tightening. The meaning was clear enough. By noon the clouds began gathering again, darker, thicker, low enough to touch. The air grew heavy, the kind that sits on a man's shoulders like guilt. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, not near, but coming. Elias cleaned his rifle without hurry. His hands moved from habit, wiping the barrel, checking the cylinder, oiling the hinge. He told himself it was precaution, but the way his heart paced said otherwise. The woman watched him from the bed. Atsala. He had learned the name the night before when she whispered it half asleep, as if afraid the air might take it away. Now her gaze was steady on him. Calm, not afraid. That calmness, more than anything, unsettled him. It meant she knew this pattern. Men, horses, rain, the rhythm of pursuit. He tried not to think about it. He busied himself fixing the shutter, stacking more wood by the door. Anything that didn't make him face the question of what he'd do when those riders came back. By late afternoon the sky had turned to slate. Wind rushed through the pines, bending their tops like bowed heads. Then came the sound he'd been waiting for, hooves on wet ground, slow and deliberate. He stepped to the doorway, rifle loose in his hands. 4 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. They reined in just short of the fence water, dripping from their coats, hats pulled low. The man in front, Whitmason town deputy, raised a hand. "Morning, Kane," he called, voice casual but sharp around the edges. "Heard you pulled something out of the river." Elias didn't answer. Mason smiled like a man trying to remember whether they were friends. "You got her in there." Elias said nothing. The silence stretched thin between them, straining until it turned sharp. "You know the rules," Mason went on. "Territory don't take kindly to harboring their kind. Army calls them hostiles. Folks say she's cursed. Tribe threw her out for a reason." Elias stepped off the porch. The mud sucked at his boots. "She's hurt," he said. "Can't walk." "That's so." "Then she's a burden. Best thing for both of you's to let her go." Mason's grin never reached his eyes. Behind him the other men shifted in their saddles, restless. One spat into the mud, another thumbed the hammer of his rifle, pretending not to. Behind Elias the wind began to rise, pushing through the trees with the breath of something ancient. The air changed warmer, electric, alive with the smell of iron and ozone. He said quietly, "River tried. Didn't take her." The smile faded from Mason's face. "You forget your wife, Kane, what happened at San Pedro Creek." Elias's jaw tightened. He could still see the water that night, his wife's hair spread like black ink over the surface, the way he'd dragged her from the current too late. Mason knew exactly where to cut. "No," he said finally, "I remember." A flash split the sky white against gray, and thunder cracked like a rifle shot. The horses shied, snorting, eyes rolling. Mason cursed under his breath, struggling to steady his reins. He could feel the storm breaking above them, the air so thick it almost hummed. "She stays," Elias said. For a long time nobody moved. Then Mason spat into the mud, turned his horse. "You're a fool," he said over his shoulder. "She'll drag you down with her." Elias's voice came calm, the way calm can only come from someone who's decided too much already. "Maybe, but I can swim." They rode off just as the first drops fell quick and cold, turning the clearing into a blur of gray. The wind hit moments later, bending the trees sideways, howling through every crack in the walls. Elias stood there in the open, letting the rain soak him through. It wasn't defiance, it was recognition. The world had always been like this, storm against man, mercy against memory. When he finally went inside, Atsala was waiting. Her hand gripped the edge of the bed, knuckles white. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his, dark and steady, asking the question that language couldn't carry. He set the rifle against the wall, knelt beside her. "It's all right," he said, though both of them knew it wasn't. Her fingers brushed his sleeve just once, a silent answer. Then the storm broke for real. Rain slammed the roof, each drop a hammer. The shutters rattled, wind seeping through every seam. The fire guttered, flared again. Elias checked the latch, shoved a wedge under the door, then sat by her side, back against the wall. Thunder rolled so close it shook the floorboards. The sound was more than weather, it was memory. San Pedro Creek, the flood, his wife's scream swallowed by water. He closed his eyes, forced it back. Across the room, Atsala whispered something in her tongue, the words, soft but sure. He couldn't understand them, but her voice carried a strange steadiness, as if she were talking to the storm itself. When lightning flashed, he saw her profile illuminated for an instant, calm lips, moving eyes fixed on something far beyond the cabin walls. "What are you saying?" he asked. She looked at him, rain-like trembling across her face. "Talk to sky," she said haltingly. "Tell it not take." He nodded slowly. "Then tell it twice." The words pulled a small, tired smile from her. Hours passed that way, wind, fire, silence, breath. The storm beat the world into blindness. Yet inside the cabin something like balance took shape. Once when a branch cracked outside and the sound made her flinch, he reached for her hand without thinking. She froze, then let him. Her grip was small but fierce. Neither of them spoke. When the storm's voice finally lowered to a hoarse growl, Elias stood and checked the window. The rain was thinning the forest behind it, pale and bruised. He turned back to her. She had fallen asleep, sitting up, one hand still curled around his wrist. He stayed there a while, listening to the slowing rain. He thought of what Mason had said of the word burden. He looked at her face, the scar at her temple, the faint rise and fall of her chest, and wondered if mercy was ever supposed to be easy. By dawn, the wind was gone. The sky was pale silver, the kind that follows ruin. Steam rose off the soaked earth outside, curling in soft ghosts over the field. Elias opened the door and breathed it in. Everything smelled raw, burnt, pine-wet soil smoke. The world looked clean again, but he knew better. Nothing ever washed away that easily. Behind him, her voice came small but certain. "They come back." He turned. She was awake, hair-tangled, eyes sharp. "Maybe," he said, "but next time we'll be ready." She looked at him for a long moment, then said one word: "Together." It was the first time she had used that word. Elias nodded. The fire cracked behind him, the river murmured beyond the ridge, and for the first time since the war, he didn't feel like a man waiting to die. He felt like someone standing guard for something worth the fight. Outside, the land was breathing again. Inside, the cabin held. And in the heart of the storm, two souls, one hunted by men, the other by memory, had chosen not to run. Firelight. Night came slow after the storm. The air smelled of wet cedar and ash. Clouds thinned, letting the first clean stars show through. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low orange on wood, its crackle the only sound left in the world. Elias added a log, watched the flame catch. His shirt was still damp, hair stuck to his forehead. Across from him, Atsala sat upright, blanket around her shoulders. Her face glowed in the firelight, soft, unsure, alive. He poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup and offered it to her. She took it with both hands, careful, the steam curling between them. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't answer, just nodded, once sipping slow. The silence wasn't heavy now. It was full, like soil after rain. He saw the bruise on her arm, deep blue, fading yellow. Without thinking, he reached for a strip of clean cloth, dipped it in warm water, and began to wipe away the dried mud. She stiffened, then let him. His hands were rough, his touch not. "You fought hard," he murmured. Her eyes lifted to his. "No fight," she said, voice low, halting. "Only river." He smiled faintly. "That's fight enough." She looked into the fire again, and something passed over her face, a flicker of grief, maybe gratitude. He found himself wanting to tell her about the things that kept him awake, the men he'd killed, the wife. He'd lost the reason, he'd left the world behind. He said, "Only I've done harm, not proud of it." She listened without understanding the words, but she understood the tone. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, just above the scar that crossed his ribs. Her palm was warm. He didn't move. Outside wind brushed the walls. The cabin sighed with it. He took her hand in his calloused fingers around her slender ones. There was no need to speak. The fire burned steady, two figures side by side, their shadows touching across the floorboards. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, he let her. He could feel her breathing, slow, and even as if matching the rhythm of the flame. They stayed like that for a long time. Long enough for the kettle to hiss, dry long enough for the rain smell to fade from the air. The light dimmed to coals. Elias stirred the embers, once watched the red pulse of heat rise and fall like a heartbeat. He thought maybe this is what forgiveness sounds like. And when he looked at her again, her eyes were closed, mouth softened in sleep. He pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders, then sat watching her, the kind of watching that asks for nothing, only proof that she was still there. The wind outside dropped to a whisper. The fire's last glow lingered on her face, as if refusing to leave. The morning river. The storm never came back. Morning broke clear and pale, the kind of light that makes the whole valley look like it's been washed clean. Mist rose from the ground, lifting slow between the cottonwoods. The world smelled of wet earth and Sunday. Elias opened the cabin door and stood for a while, breathing it in. His shirt clung to him from the work of mending the roof, but for once he didn't mind the ache. Behind him, he heard her voice. River, he turned. Atsala sat upright on the bed, her hands braced on the frame. Her legs didn't move, but her eyes were clear, steady. He nodded. River's still there. She gestured toward the door. Go see. Elias hesitated, then smiled. Yeah, he said softly. Let's go see. He lifted her into his arms. She was stronger now, lighter too, as if some weight had left her. Outside, the air shimmered with sunlight. Dew glittered on every blade of grass. They made their way down the path, slow, careful. The river shimmered ahead, wide and calm, as though it had forgotten how to rage. When they reached the bank, he set her down on a flat rock. The current whispered over the stones, soft as breath. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she reached into the small pouch she wore, tied around her wrist. From it she drew a single feather, brown, tipped with white. It was the one from the bird she'd buried days ago. She held it out toward the water, murmured words in Apache, then opened her hand. The feather drifted down, caught the light, and floated away. He watched it turn slow circles, gliding downstream, until it vanished around the bend. What did you say? He asked. She looked at him, the faintest smile on her lips. Not curse, she said. Journey. Elias let the words settle between them. Journey. He liked the sound of it. He reached for her hand, not to help, not to hold, just to be sure she was real. She squeezed back her grip, small but steady. Above them, a hawk cried, once high and bright. Elias looked out at the water. Then we ride it together, he said. He whistled for the horse. The gelding came down the trail, snorting softly. Elias lifted her up into the saddle, then climbed behind her, his arms loose around her waist. They rode along the river's edge, hooves thudding against the wet ground. The sun rose higher, turning the mist to gold. She leaned back against him, eyes half closed, face turned toward the light. The river sang beside them, endless and alive. Somewhere, far behind the cabin, still smoked a thin gray thread in the sky, the mark of two people who had chosen not to disappear. Elias didn't look back. He didn't need to. Ahead was only sky and water, and a stretch of land wide enough for forgiveness.
Hell.
Dust Creek's Last Supper, the girl who ate with her enemy. The empty town. The wind carried dust like prayer ash across the empty street of Dust Creek. Wooden signs swung on broken hinges, their groans mixed with the dry rattle of mesquite branches. The town had been dead since the fever 2 summers back. Only one lamp still burned after sunset, the one inside Jed Carter's old diner. He didn't run it anymore. The place was a habit, not a business. Every evening, just before the sun fell behind the red ridge, he'd strike a match, light the lantern by the counter, and let the glow spill over empty stools. The habit kept him company. Maybe it fooled the silence into thinking he wasn't alone. He'd been a drifter once, a ranch hand, a hired gun for a cattle line that didn't survive the drought. His wife, Clara, had tried to turn the diner into something more than a shack for travelers. She'd hung curtains, planted basil in tin cups, baked bread on Sundays. Fever took her quick and merciless. After that, Jed stayed because leaving would have meant admitting she was gone. Outside, the desert was a dull gold fading to rust. He stepped onto the porch, rubbing the callus on his thumb where his wedding band used to sit. The air smelled of iron and dust storm.